that's participating. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Rhett Burden, and I'm the Director of Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Belonging at Compass Family Services, a 501c3 family homelessness nonprofit located in San Francisco, California. And I'm so excited to welcome you all to the 15th installment of our Inclusion Talk series featuring Dr. Autumn BlackDeer. The Inclusion Talk series is a series that was created to honor cultural heritage months. And as we know, it is Native American Heritage Month. And I could not think of a better speaker to bring to our agency, our community, than Dr. Autumn BlackDeer. Now, there's a little bit that I could say, but I know Dr. BlackDeer has her own slide where she introduces herself. So I want to be very respectful of that and not steal that thunder that she's going to bring. For all of you that are here, whether you work at Compass Family Services or you're a member of our community at large, this is being recorded. You will find this recording on our Compass Family Services YouTube page. Again, Compass Family Services on YouTube. You can also follow the agency on all social platforms if you want to learn all that we're doing to positively impact the community. And with that said, I'm going to turn it over to our speaker and highlight her for the room, Dr. Autumn BlackDeer.
Well, hello. Thanks so much for having me. I'm really looking forward to sharing space with y'all this afternoon, evening, depending on where you're at. It's still early afternoon for me out here in Denver, Colorado. So I'm going to go ahead and get my screen sharing so we can make the most of our time together. All right. So the title of the talk, just really collaborating with Rhett and really appreciate having this opportunity. I feel such great energy from Rhett. So we should all just give it up. Appreciate that way to center the space. I love it. And I always say, like, we can create community online. It does not have to be only in person. So I'm grateful that we can sort of create this space together. So thank you, Rhett, for starting us off great. Thank you, everybody, for bringing your own energy. And I'm just excited to be with y'all. So we're going to talk about decolonizing and indigenizing. The original focus, I was just going to talk about, like health disparities in Indigenous communities. But in talking with Rhett, we really kind of decided on more of a kind of conversational sort of talk and really going to try my hand at doing more intentional storytelling. And so I'm excited to kind of step into this more creative lane. So let's get into it. So our elders have taught us, and my elders specifically have taught me that before I just start spouting off what I know, it's important to tell people who you are. So I just wanted to say hello. My name is Autumn Asher BlackDeer. I am Nacistas, which is the Southern Cheyenne Nation out in Western Oklahoma, but we are actually on my tribe's traditional homelands right now in Denver, Colorado. So I work here at the University of Denver as an assistant professor in the School of Social Work. But I like to describe myself really as an anti-colonial scholar activist, and most importantly, as an ancestor in training. So the things that I'm doing today, I'm here only because of the ancestors and folks that have came before me that really paved this way. And so I'm trying to do things today that will benefit the next generation that's coming along. And that to me is more important than tenure, publications, and all of those sorts of things. So that's where I'm coming from. I describe myself as a quantitative native. A lot of folks, especially Indigenous folks in higher ed, are typically more lent towards qualitative approaches, which makes sense for things like storytelling, traditional knowledge. But I am more interested, and I think just the way my brain works, I think of things in quantitative terms and numbers and statistics. And so I am trying to make that more of an acceptable form of storytelling and seeing how we can really tell our community stories with data. So yeah, that's me. And I'm really excited to just be with you all and to share on what we're here for, how we can uplift and encourage Indigenous communities and really be good relatives in whatever space that we occupy. So typically at this point is when somebody will come up and read a land acknowledgement usually. So we have introductions, housekeeping, and then someone will start to say, like, we would like to acknowledge that we're on the unceded land of the whatever nation and we promise to do better, something like that, right? But it's typically in this sort of like past tense kind of voice, right? Like that there's no more Native people here anymore, that they were historically here, right? And so a lot of times land acknowledgements continue to put colonialism and continue to put Indigenous people in the past. And so I really like to kind of draw our attention to this and disrupt that practice of like, are we actually being inclusive, or are we just reading things and doing more performative kinds of actions? So I love this quote or tweet by Shonda, who talks about, if we situate colonialism in the past, we're really not reckoning with the present, and we're not demanding a better future for how we're being in relation with one another and with the land and non-human beings, right? And so there's a great essay that you can read called Your Land Acknowledgement Is Not Enough. And there's a quote from that says, like, without action or structural change, acknowledging stolen land is just what Tuck and Yang refer to as a settler move to innocence, right? These institutions are not innocent and settlers are not innocent, right? And so coming from a higher education background, academia, a lot of folks love to read land acknowledgements. It was like my first day of work here at the University of Denver, and they were like, we honor their sacrifices or something. And I was like, what? Colonialism was not a sacrifice. We did not willingly agree to any of these things, right? So we really have to problematize what are we actually doing and have that sort of critical awareness of what we're talking about. So this is an excerpt from that article. I encourage you to read the full article if you want to, or maybe just, casually send it or share it to someone that talks about, this is basically the boilerplate, right? And I can put it on my young elder voice and read it. Like, this building is situated on the unceded land of the XYZ people, right? And as if those people are still not here, and as if this all happened in the past, right? And then you breathe deeply, sternly, and continue, right? We pay homage to the original stewards of these lands, right? And we're all like suddenly moved and we agree, right? As if just this like solemn head nod was the same thing as like actually returning stolen land, right? Or actually supporting Indigenous people in the present day, right? And so I just love this, like, a land acknowledgement is not enough. So that's not what we're doing today, right? So if you wanted to start thinking about how you can go beyond a land acknowledgement and to really kind of be a better relative, or to be a good relative, be in better relation with Indigenous folks in your community. And also thinking about, I've seen folks to start do like land and labor acknowledgements, right? Because a lot of our country we know was built from stolen labor, stolen lives that were dispossessed through slavery, right? So there's a lot of things that like are missed whenever folks are like, oh, this is the land. Thanks so much. The end, right? So thinking about how can we be a good relative? How can we actively support tribal sovereignty? And the Native Governance Center has a really great website with resources for folks. So they have a self-assessment that your organization can do. They have information on like paying voluntary land taxes to local Indigenous groups that have been displaced or maybe are trying to reclaim their land there. And then there's this huge guide on beyond land acknowledgements. And so I always, as a social worker, I'm always sending people resources like, here you go. So definitely check that out, and feel free to share that with other folks that you know that might be kind of struggling with this practice, right? I get a lot of questions about them, like, is this okay? Can you read our land acknowledgement? What do you think? And so just to say, maybe it's not the best to just do something for the sake of doing it, right? So we can be critical about it. Oh. So thinking about just a brief introduction to looking at Indigenous communities. So kind of like a Native 101, there are more than 600 Native nations across the United States and over 175 languages being spoken, Native Indigenous languages that are being spoken today. Indigeneity, or thinking about who counts as American Indian, Alaska Native, Native Hawaiian, right? All of these things, it's not just a race or ethnicity, right? And a lot of folks actually probably wouldn't identify as American Indian or Native American, right? Like, I introduce myself as Cheyenne. So a lot of us introduce ourselves by our people, our clans, right? Those sorts of things. But being Indigenous in the United States is actually a political status, because we're meant to be seen as like sovereign governments, right? So the way that the federal government is supposed to interact with Indigenous people is meant to be like a sovereign to sovereign relationship. However, we know that that has not been the case. So American Indian Alaska Native communities represent almost 3% of the US population, and that number is actually growing over the past few years. And despite what most people think, actually the majority of us reside outside of tribal lands or outside of reservations. So about 78%, so nearly 80% of us do not reside on our traditional tribal homelands, right? And then lastly, we have more Native folks in elected positions in the United States government than ever before. We have Secretary of the Interior, Deb Haaland. We have multiple representatives, senators, folks that are really kind of indigenizing the space. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. But just wanted to kind of get us off, thinking about who we're talking about, where we're at, situate ourselves, and kind of be in relation to the current context. So Brett was really encouraging me to kind of tell a story and bring us along. So I wanted to go back to the beginning and kind of talk about a little bit about my educational journey. So I was raised by my mom and my grandmother, who are full-blooded Cheyenne women, and it was kind of just an expectation that we would go to college. It wasn't really a question. My mom made us think like, you can do whatever you want as soon as you finish college. So we were like, okay, sure. And so I actually ended up doing concurrent enrollment in high school, where I went to college half a day. So I graduated college with I graduated high school with like a year's worth of college credits. So I went to undergrad only for 3 years. So I got to graduate early. And I started out actually as a journalism major. I wanted to be a news anchor and read the news, which we all know how the news is going now. So glad that I did not choose that route. But my mom's major whenever she went to college was in journalism. And so I was like, I'm gonna do that. And it was fun. And I think I do enjoy storytelling and having a more creative sort of lens. So I appreciate having that year to have fun, I guess. But over the summer, after my first year of college, I went home and I had a summer job working at Vista Health, which is a behavioral health service. And so over the summer, I worked at the therapeutic day treatment program and just really saw a lot of unmet mental health needs. And I was like, our clinical director was a woman who had her LCSW. And so I was like, I want to be you. Like, I want to do what you do. And so when I went back to school in the fall, I changed my major to psychology because we didn't have social work. And I was like, I'll get my undergrad in psychology, then I'll go get my master's and I'll be like in it, right? So I finished college and went on to get my master's in social work at the University of Oklahoma in Tulsa. Boomer Sooner, there's only one Oklahoma, which is also my mom's alma mater. So that was really cool to get to do that. But it was actually during my master's program that I had my first Indigenous advisor of my entire life, right? My first time ever having an Indigenous professor, and really just building that community. And so during my 2-year, getting your MSW is usually a 2-year process. And we were really encouraged to write about a social justice issue. And so this was my first semester of grad school, and I wrote about Indigenous women experiencing sexual violence, right? And so I found out that through just writing that paper that 1 in 3 Native women will experience violence in her lifetime. And I was like, this is horrific, right? Like my family, there's 3 of us, right? My mom, my sister, and me, right? And I was like, I was that 1 in 3, right? My mom's generation, there's 3 sisters, my mom and her 2 sisters, and my aunt had experienced that as well. So she was that 1 in 3 for her generation. Then my grandma, her sister, had also been assaulted in her lifetime. So it was literally every single woman across a generation in my family had experienced sexual violence. And so I'm like, these statistics are more than just numbers, right? These are people and our stories, right? And so I was really just kind of struck with this about what can we do about this? What are people doing about this, right? And so at that point, I kind of shifted from looking only at mental health towards looking at also sexual violence, intimate partner violence, and how we can actually intervene, right? So I knew that when I was getting my master's degree that doing clinical work and the program was very clinically heavy, right? And so there really wasn't a macro option that folks could actually do. So I knew I didn't want to just do micro social work. I was like, this is a huge systemic issue. We need to have systemic responses, right? And so my advisor was like, have you ever considered getting your PhD? Have you ever thought about, continuing on? And so from there, we just worked together the rest of the time. So finished my first year, second year, started applying to PhD programs, finished my master's, and then went straight through to the doctoral program. And it's wild because I actually ended up going to the same place that she got her PhD from, at Washington University in St. Louis. And she was actually the first Indigenous woman to get her PhD from the program. So it was kind of like seeing these like through lines and legacies in higher education. So when I started off, I really was thinking about like, how do Native women experience resiliency after experiencing sexual violence, right? So I didn't want to just keep documenting the problem. Like I didn't want to do more work that was just like showing that sexual violence is an issue. I'm like, well, let's think about it from like a strengths-based framework, right? And so I talked about resiliency, or maybe like culturally bound emphasis on resiliency, or like how do Indigenous people conceptualize resiliency. But I had, academics are very kind with their words, and I had someone say, if I line up people in a row and I hit them all with a hammer and then I ask them how they recover from that, other people might ask you, why don't you just stop the person with the hammer instead of waiting for them to get hit? And not very eloquent, not very kind, but I did try to sit with the message, right? Like I was like, there's something in here to be said, right? And so I was thinking like, this is essentially the issue of working at either upstream issues or downstream issues, right? So instead of downstream where someone has already experienced harm and trying to encourage healing and resiliency and those sorts of things, I was like, how can we look further upstream and to try to essentially attack the guy with the hammer, right? Take the hammer from whoever. But this was all really grounded in these sort of like Western frameworks and Western ways of knowing. And so again, it's all very grounded in that idea of like, what is the problem? What problem are you trying to solve? What population has a problem that you can address? And that to me is not really how we think as Indigenous communities, right? We think about well-being, we think about being in harmony with nature and one another. And so really trying to approach things from this lens, I think I really struggled with that. Like, it was just like, I remember, doing all of these exercises and having our sticky notes, and we all did peer review with one another. And folks were like, oh yeah, this has helped me think about my ideas and whatever. But for me, I really struggled with how to like meaningfully integrate anybody's feedback, because I'm like, I'm not even really solid on the question. So I'm not sure that me getting feedback on this and just more ways to make it more westernized and more deficit based really wasn't helping me. So from here, I actually had kind of a aha moment in learning about structural violence. And so I was actually working with a system dynamics professor, and we were talking about we were doing work on gender-based violence on college campuses. And so he was telling me about looking at structural violence as kind of like whenever one man abuses his wife, that's considered like intimate partner violence. But if we find out that 70% of men are abusing their wives, that's structural violence, right? Like that's a thing that we don't really see it, but it's just kind of in the nature of our society, right? And so looking at structural violence actually comes from the field of peace studies, which I thought was interesting. But it's really just a way of looking at the world that kind of can account for these broader systemic issues, right? So violence that's built into the fabric of society. And so it's essentially saying that society is structured in a way that creates, enforces, and maintains these inequalities. So we don't see them, right? There's an example of structural violence as like, if it's outside and you're raining and you're holding an umbrella, structural violence isn't the rain or the umbrella or like your little rain shoes. It's like essentially the clouds, right? Like you don't actually see it until you are experiencing the effects of rain and getting wet and those sorts of things, right? So in thinking about my work with sexual violence, it is a way to kind of move beyond looking at who's the victim, who's the perpetrator, who's impacted, but it really helps to see this kind of holistic perspective of the overall like political situation, social history, economic systems, right? And so, especially with working with Indigenous communities, a lot of folks said that being Indigenous is the biggest risk factor for you to experience violence. And it's like, being Indigenous is not the risk factor. It's the racism and structural discrimination that comes with being an Indigenous person that makes you more at risk, right? So really problematizing, again, those Western frameworks and Western ways of knowing, right? To say that I do need a policy chapter talking about federal Indian history and how we got here, because a lot of issues with sexual violence comes with the ways that Indigenous people have been dehumanized since colonization, right? And there's a lot of policies that are still in play today that we're still dealing with that have kind of framed, again, national consciousness of Indigenous people and access to our land and traditional practices and all of those sorts of things, right? And so it was a push to be in a Western higher education institution and to try to start to talk about these broader things, because someone's like, how are you going to measure colonialism, right? How are you going to capture that in a data set? But just because it's critiqued doesn't mean it can't be done, right? So if you wanted a kind of short glimpse, this is not really short, but looking at manifestations of structural violence for Indigenous communities, it's really a way that we can account for colonialism in the present day. So it's not just like, oh, colonialism happened forever ago, people just need to get over it. It's like, no, it began with like exploiting land and resources, but it's also continued today, right? And we can very clearly see that. I think a lot of folks are having a sort of global awakening to how colonialism definitely continues to the present day. But this is essentially, this is from a really great publication that I recommend folks check out. But it really talks about how the policies, like historical policies of federal Indian law, have kind of set the scene for how we see manifestations of structural violence today. So like the Indian Health Service is the federal trust responsibility to provide healthcare for Indigenous communities. It's chronically underfunded. Like, I think the US spends less than half of what it does on Indigenous people as it does on sailors, on incarcerated folks, on the Navy, right? So we are literally at the bottom of the ranks. The Indian Health Service is also situated through policy to be like kind of fought over for funding every year. So we never have stable funding. So it's always decreasing as well. So then whenever folks are talking about like chronic illnesses or health disparities among Native communities, it's like, it's not because we're just inherently unhealthy people, right? It's because things have been intentionally put in place to kind of cut our legs out from under us, right? Ongoing issues with, you know, lack of access to our own data. I just talked about, you know, decolonizing data and how we're not ever included in federal registries of administrative data, right? That those numbers and those counts are what decides like who gets allocations for what funding, what programs get more resources or not. And so the intentional exclusion and erasure of Indigenous people perpetuates these issues, right? So what we can kind of see today is that essentially these broader disparities that you see for Indigenous communities are often attributed to being Indigenous rather than the systems and structures of oppression that are underlying literally the entire country, right? So I won't get into all of that. I've made it a point to not ever do any more presentations that just rattle off Indigenous health disparities forever. So we're just going to say all of those things are structurally connected and should be structurally addressed. So whenever I started learning about structural violence, I really had an opportunity in my doctoral program to complete all 3 of my teaching assistantships with all Indigenous scholars. So I got to co-teach, co-learn, co-instruct with strong social work Indigenous scholars and really see what a decolonized classroom can look like, what it means to hold space, getting to see how we can map system dynamics or how we can use system dynamics to map structural violence. So all of those sort of like quantitative native wheels just started turning. And so I was just starting to see like it's all across the systems. So now whenever I teach research courses, and there's, you know, that one meme, I'm not even sure what show it's from, where that guy has like all these things stuck to the wall and like the red lines, and he just kind of looks really unhinged, and he's like, see, like they're all connected. I usually have one or two students send me that every quarter to say like, Dr. BlackDeer, this is you, because you're always like, it's all connected, it's all connected. But it is all connected, right? So I began to kind of change my question to thinking about what are these factors, right? How can we illuminate these sort of structural level factors that are creating structural violence for us, and how can we deal with that, right? So in one of our classes, I think it was Indigenous policy, we had an exercise, and I gave everybody like one of those gigantic sticky notes, and folks went into their own little groups. And so we had one group that was like causes or results of structural violence. One was context, that's this little turtle down here. One was about culture and traditional knowledge, and then we had one about policy. And it's kind of hard to see, but there's a lot of like arrows pointing to one another, and kind of like making these connections and seeing how like our traditional culture was interrupted by structural violence. And so acts to reclaim that also connect to policy, because there's like repatriation and NACRA and those sorts of things. And then thinking about disparities and issues that we have in our communities today are a manifestation of structural violence. But if we lean more to our culture and our traditional knowledge, we can use that to heal those issues, right? So we kind of all ended up realizing that they all go together, right? And that to me is like fundamentally what I want to do. Like if I could do that and have that class over and over again for the rest of my career, I would be good with that. So thinking about like, it's not just one Western way of doing things, and starting to kind of carve out these spaces for Indigenous knowledge, and to start to kind of question the way that we do things, right? The disrupting the status quo and saying there are more than just one way of looking at things, more than one way to look at our communities, and to really do research fundamentally, right? And then learning from Indigenous scholars and co-teaching, being able to do that was like, there's another way to be in a classroom that's not this like professor versus students, right? Like we literally ended every class with talking circles. We would cry together. We had potlucks, right? And I'm like, this has literally felt like a community gathering every time, rather than like an obligation or like a classroom. And so that to me is like fundamentally set me on the path that I'm on today, to really being in community and trying to create that in every classroom and in every kind of community like we're in today. And so I was in the doctoral program in 2020, whenever the world kind of turned upside down. So there was the onset of the global pandemic, but there was also the kind of like great racial justice awakening, right? Folks were like, oh, oppression. And so kind of one of the things that came to fruition at that time was thinking about other ways of doing things, right? So abolition, anti-racism, and decolonization all kind of rose to the top, specifically in social work. And so folks were like, what the heck is going on? How can we actually account for these things? And I was like, I've got just a thing, decolonization, right? So I'd experienced kind of decolonial classrooms, been getting more ingrained in the theory. And so thinking about applying this to my work, but also once you start doing, decolonial work, it translates to your entire life, right? Like this is part of like living your politic. So it's kind of like, we can undo colonialism wherever we go, right? Everything, you just can't help but see it, right? And so that's where I get that guy. So it can be things like returning to your traditional ways of being. So prior to colonial context, so things like addressing our own internalized oppression and colonization, reclaiming our traditional languages, practicing our culture, right? All of those things are examples of decolonization. But the overall logical endpoint of decolonization is to dismantle these harmful structures of oppression. So it's not Indigenous people doing diversity work. That's not decolonization, right? So this kind of image, I think, is what folks are usually missing. They think like decolonizing is centering Indigenous voices, and then that's kind of it. but it's also this overall kind of, it's a framework, right, to see the world. It's a critical lens where you can start to see like, these are lasting impacts of colonialism. Like, this is how we're dealing with this, right? The next level up is about achieving sovereignty. So a lot of times folks don't even have an idea of what tribal sovereignty is, or really kind of orienting themselves towards thinking about liberation. And so I'm like, these are all levels to decolonization, right? It's not just Indigenous people doing diversity work, right? And then the bigger kind of overall circle says challenging colonial systems. And that's truly like the end game, right? Like, we are here to upend and dismantle systems of oppression and harm, right? And so this kind of gets lost in a lot of discourse, I think. So a lot of folks are like, decolonization is a buzzword. That's a nice idea. We can't all go back to riding horses, right? And so the idea that lumping in decolonization with like diversity, equity, and inclusion is that it does a disservice to folks that are doing work that will actually target those bigger structures that we mentioned, right? And so the kind of fundamental reading for this is decolonization is not a metaphor, like we said at the very beginning, talking about Tuck and Yang's seminal work. But they really say like, it's not a metaphor for the other things we want to do that will improve our societies and our schools, right? So there's a lot of things that people do that's helpful and it's great and it's important, but it's not truly decolonization, right? So adding people of color to the syllabus or to the curriculum, like, great, you should do that. You should seek to have a really well-rounded educational approach, but that's not changing the fundamentally oppressive nature of higher education, right? Devaluing hierarchies, amplifying certain voices, right? Like, all of those things are great and we should do them, but it's not fundamentally challenging the colonial system underneath, right? So there's kind of two different areas that we're coming from, right? So diversity, equity, inclusion are more under this sort of social justice paradigm, right? So it's like, we can reform or we can recognize people within these current systems, right? So a social justice framework would say representation matters, right? And it's like, that's great. No one's saying that representation should not matter, right? But decolonial work is more in alignment with things that are anti-capitalist, anti-colonial, and again, focused on sovereignty and liberation. So it's more actually in alignment with like abolition, right? To kind of upend these systems that are harmful entirely, rather than to just kind of diversify the organizations themselves. So on the contrary, so when we're talking about not buzzwordifying, looking at decolonization, I always like to say that like indigenization or indigenizing things, it's kind of, for me, where I've seen it is mostly the generation above me that focus on a lot of indigenizing things. So it's really those efforts to like preserve our cultural heritage and identity, right? So realizing that our personal and collective process of decolonizing and restoring our own self-determination is indigenizing. So it's a lane of decolonization, but it's not the end, right? So they go hand in hand. However, folks have really kind of critiqued indigenizing, specifically whenever it comes from like non-Indigenous folks, that it can feel like othering or further marginalization, right? So folks are like, you adding, so especially in social work, like a lot of interventions are based in like cognitive behavioral therapy, and they're like, oh, well, we'll just add in Indigenous examples and that'll be great. And it's like, just because you have like little simulated people that have feathers on their heads does not make it more inclusive, right? That does not make it appropriate, right? And so we kind of call this the, you know, add a feather phenomenon. And this kind of also can contribute to the idea of like a pan-Indigenous group of folks, right? So again, trying to not go too far into the data, but a lot of problems with data, if we are actually included, is that there's just this huge group of Indigenous people, and there's no way to kind of meaningfully separate it by geographic region or tribal affiliation or connection to culture, right? Traditional identity, those sorts of things, right? And so it can kind of just lead folks to having this large group of like Indigenous people but there's really no specificity in there, right? And we know that, again, we started out seeing over 600 Native nations, right? So there's no way to say like, oh, this is the indigenous way of doing things, because there's so many of us, right? We all have different traditions and beliefs and practices, right? And so a lot of folks kind of further problematize indigenizing and say, like, you're really just asking us to kind of box up and squish indigenous knowledge into Western frameworks, right? And that's another thing that people think decolonization is. If we just add an indigenous person in, that's decolonizing, and it's not, right? Thinking about like indigenous police forces, right? There's that new show on HBO, and folks are like, oh my gosh, this is so cool, Native police. That's not helping anyone, right? Like from an abolitionist perspective, furthering the kind of like prison industrial complex, the militarization of police, right? All of these other issues. So having Native people become an oppressor is not decolonizing, right? What benefit does that do, right? So it's kind of saying like, well, you could be your own oppressors now and just kind of oppress one another, and then we won't have to do as much, right? So not the best for us, right? So if we're thinking about looking at, should I say decolonizing, should I say indigenizing? I would say indigenizing is like being included into a Western system, but maybe making a Native version of it. Whereas decolonizing is really trying to dismantle these systems fundamentally. So there's this picture of me that I posted whenever I defended my dissertation at WashU. And that's me in my traditional tribal regalia. And somebody said it looks like I'm holding a wand, like in Harry Potter, which I also was not allowed to watch as a child, so I have no reference for that. But it's actually my fan. This is an eagle feather fan. It's just turned to the side. But this is like the famous WashU clock tower, and everyone, you know, whatever. And so I put this picture up as an example of like, this is me indigenizing WashU or indigenizing my dissertation process. But me in regalia on WashU's campus does not fundamentally challenge the colonial nature of WashU, right? Like, it's not undoing any harm at the university. It's not making it any less oppressive for folks. This is a fundamentally example of like representation matters, right? So like, sure, it might be inspiring for young Native folks to see someone on a college campus today in the regalia and being like, yeah, I could be my full self there. But does it fundamentally dismantle or challenge the overall colonial nature of higher education, of WashU? No, not necessarily, right? So I would say that they're not, one's not better than the other, they just have different goals, right? So it's important for us to kind of separate those two and provide that nuance when we're looking at it. So thinking about how we can move towards a decolonial praxis. So praxis is putting theory into action, right? And so a praxis for us and how we can begin to start our decolonial journey, reignite your decolonial journey, send you on some sort of journey together, would be this kind of idea of that conscious and continuous learning and unlearning, right? So whenever we talked about looking at decolonization and inviting in that sort of overall critical lens, right? So we have to also challenge our minds, right? We've been matriculated in this sort of Western colonial society. So everyone has the responsibility to decolonize, not just Indigenous people, right? We all have to kind of start to begin to challenge that sort of inner colonial voice, right? So abolition says to abolish your inner cop. Decolonization would say to exercise your inner colonizer. So how can we really interrupt the process of just continuing these colonial systems, right? Instead of trying to reform them, instead of trying to diversify them, instead of trying to have more sense of belonging in colonial institutions, what would it look like to truly dismantle them and create a more equitable system, right? How can we center values of liberation and sovereignty as we're working to create better futures, right? So this kind of idea of praxis is learning about the theory, so learning about decolonization as a theoretical framework, reflecting in our own lives and how that can apply to our work, our lives, our scholarship, right? moving into action, guided by that theory, and reflecting again, right? So you don't want to just have a nice idea but never do anything with it, but you don't want to just run out into the streets and say you're doing things in the name of decolonization without that true kind of sitting with and wrestling with the material as well. So praxis is, I love that this graphic was like reflection, reflection, reflection. Like all of my classes, I'm like, we're going to reflect, we're going to pause, we're going to kind of sit with these things, right? And to me, that's one of the biggest things of having this sort of decolonial praxis in our sort of like grind culture society that says produce and make money and produce some more. Practicing that sort of pause of like, I'm actually not going to jump. I'm going to sit and marinate and reflect and work with these things before I move into action, right? And kind of cultivating that space of where you can move at a slower pace, right? And to really create that space for you, for your coworkers, for your communities, right? To say, we're not going to run through life at breakneck speed, right? And really that is decolonizing, right? That valuing the process itself over the outcome, that's inherently decolonial, right? We're not just doing things for the sake of doing them. And I also think that there's no endpoint, right? We never arrive, right? So this is also what makes people deeply uncomfortable about decolonization, right? Is because folks want to say, I did it. I did the work, check. I've checked my privilege. I've, become decolonial. I'm decolonized, the end. But it's an ongoing thing, right? Like I've been doing this for 10-ish years and I'm still on a journey, right? I will never like get to a place that I'm like, I'm good. I don't need to do any more work, right? I'm always reflecting. I'm always learning new things. I'm always being, self-reflexive and really trying to model that for the folks I'm in community with, right? And how this is just a way of being, right? And if we think about it, about indigenizing, that's an example of an indigenous relational worldview, right? So the idea that we're not thinking about Western hierarchies and, who's at the bottom of the pyramid, who's at the top, and where we are in ranking, but as a relational worldview, it's more of a circle, right? And so the idea is that there's no one higher or lower than anyone in the circle. And if we're thinking mathematically, like you can be any point in the circle, right? It's not a line between like, oh, you're on this side of the circle, I'm going to draw a line to where you're at in the circle. It's like we are points. So there are infinite points in a circle, right? So the idea is that we can see things valuing the kind of interconnectedness that we all have rather than that Western independence, bootstraps mentality of produce and conquer and succeed at all costs, right? So I just wanted to leave us with some reflection questions, and I'm happy to answer questions that you all have. And if you wanted to just take a screenshot of these or come back to them whenever we post the recording. But just thinking about like, what does it mean to you to think about decolonization in terms of your mind, your body, your heart, and your spirit, right? So a lot of times we're just taught, think about it, process it, move on, right? But how can you think about this in other aspects? Where does this land in your body, right? The disconnect between our heads and our hearts is definitely a Western imposition, right? So really returning to our bodies, returning to ourselves, right? What are some key insights that you've gathered regarding yourself and the world that we live in from this session, from other things that you've thought about with decolonial kind of work? What about other experiences that you've had, similar journeys that you might be on, self-healing, anything like that? What can these insights meaningfully, or how can these insights meaningfully connect with the task of decolonization, right? So kind of first writing out your thoughts and thinking about how is this landing for you? What questions do you still have? Are there areas that you want to further explore internally? And then how can you really connect that with your decolonial journey, right? And then moving into kind of a praxis of living your politic and thinking about what would it look like for you to play an active role in decolonization, right? Academically, professionally, socially, politically, personally, in all of these aspects, right? How can you really think about putting this into your life? What would that look like? What would stop you from doing something like that? What do you feel that you need to kind of either reignite your journey, take further steps, right? What would you want your journey to look like, essentially? Okay, so you don't have to answer any of these right now. You certainly are welcome to, but just kind of things that you can take home. I know it's a lot of information at once too, and asking folks to kind of like question everything you've ever been taught is a lot. So be gentle with yourselves as you are starting or resuming this, and to just really think about the idea of a possibility or an elsewhere, right? So one of the biggest things that I think decolonization and abolition really pair nicely is when we think about dreaming new worlds into being, right? There are other ways of doing things. And so it's not all tear it down, burn it all down, hate these systems, right? It's also like, what can we build instead, right? So abolitionists talk about the ever nearing abolitionist horizon, right? And so it's kind of like always looking towards that horizon. What's, what's coming? What do we want to see in that future world? And I think decolonization is absolutely a good partner for that, to think about if we are saying that there are more ways to do things than just this Western colonial perspective, what would we want to see in that space? How would we want that to look? And how would we want to be in that space as well? So thinking about the idea of creating our own elsewheres is what I want to kind of end with today. So Nyash, thank you so much for having me. I'm happy to answer questions or have a discussion. I don't know what time it is.
Dr. BlackDeer, thank you so much. It is 2:50, so we have about 10 minutes. If folks want to either put their questions in the chat or come off of mute. Again, I want to thank you on behalf of Compass Family Services. Thank you for your scholarship. Thank you for being here. You are truly fantastic, and I hope that everyone really enjoyed everything that you had to say today. I saw someone put in the chat, it looks like there's a lot of kudos going to you in the chat. So yes, I'll second and third all of that. And this presentation will be available either later this week or early next. And you can follow Compass Family Services on YouTube to find this recording and all of the past Inclusion Talk series. But enough about that. I want to make sure that if you have a question, you have a chance to ask our speaker. So does anybody want, it looks like there is a question. It looks like we have some people raising their hands. There's a question in the chat. So I'll go to the people that are raising their hands. I see Ruth. Ruth, do you want to come off of mute and ask Dr. BlackDeer a question?
Thank you so much, Dr. BlackDeer. I just want to give you big props and thank you. It is beautiful to see you speak your truth and to know that, as another Indigenous scholar in social work, wanting to, that we will occupy these spaces in the best ways for our ancestors. So no questions to you, my friend. Just love, respect, and a reminder that you are the ancestors' best dreams. So Nyawa Goha.
Thank you.
Very, very nice, Ruth. Thank you so much. I see, and please forgive me if I mispronounce your name. Is it Mies? You just came off of mute, but go ahead and ask your question. We can't hear you. Could you try again? Still can't hear you, unfortunately. Would you like to put your question in the chat? Unfortunately, we still can't hear you. Please put your question in the chat and we will make sure that Dr. BlackDeer has a chance to get to it. I see Sandy. I'm sorry if I mispronounced your name. Please forgive me. Do you have a question?
Red, it is Sandy. Very good. And one of the things that I've been following on my Dr. Auntie here is the way that she's been publishing papers and how they're a little bit different than the normal academic format. And I'm wondering what it is that you do to make that decolonized presenting of some of the data and the things that you have to do academically. How are you decolonizing that? What's a way that I can go to follow in that?
Thank you, Auntie. It's good to see you. I love you. Yeah, I think it really depends on the kind of availability of what the avenue is. So a lot of times I'm spending more time trying to focus on public outlets and more public scholarship to kind of decentralize this kind of academic publishing institution, right? So all of the like paywalls and you have to subscribe to certain journals and things like that. And so I am trying to do more they call it public scholarship. And so things like today, like where we're talking about things, and I'm happy to make resource lists. I see that question in the chat. I'm happy to make a list so I can send to Rhett and so we can send out the slides and kind of maybe host those all together. But really kind of the idea of like these knowledge hierarchies, right? That's what higher education is built off of, and that exclusion. And so really trying to break that down to say like, we all deserve to learn and to share in our lived experiences and to try to kind of value that lived experience knowledge just as much as this academic, what's on paper, those sorts of things. So I hope that answered the question.
Thank you. I see Camilla. Would you like to come off mute?
Yes. Hi, Dr. BlackDeer. I really, really liked everything that you said, and it was lovely to hear just what you were talking about. And I think for a lot of it, it just like resonated with me, just like I recently graduating, so it's very, very fresh in my head. But I've been thinking on just like older generations, like my mom and my grandpa, when I have this like difficult conversations about reimagining structures and like decolonial powers and like abolition and things like that. How do you approach it when you're trying to teach it, right? How do you approach it as someone that might be a little bit more like hesitant because it has been enforced for like 500 years or more?
Yeah, no, that's such a great question. I try to always approach it from the perspective of like, it's a possibility. So like, I just taught our like power, privilege, and oppression class for the first time. And a lot of folks are like, never teach that class as a woman of color. Like, it's a bad idea. You'll get terrible reviews, right? But it was really great. And I approached the class not from saying like, decolonization is the only way. I'm like, there are many different frameworks and ideas that can kind of get us to the same goal. And so I try to just invite that possibility of like, there are a lot of critical frameworks that have kind of siblings, right? Like, or maybe cousins. And so it's kind of like, there are different ways of seeing the world that maybe decolonization doesn't fit with you because colonialism is harder for certain folks to kind of attach to and grapple with. So thinking about things like, we had a lesson on queer theory, right? And seeing things as like, we're questioning the binaries of society, right? And that's a fundamental thing of queer theory. Like, does it always have to be yes, no, male, female, right? We looked at other critical theories like Afrocentric theory, right? And so that's definitely more lent to thinking about African-American and Black American experiences of like seeing the world and reclaiming those traditional values, right? So maybe that's your framework that you want to work with. Similarly with like abolition, right? Folks can maybe have a better grasp on the prison industrial complex, right? And so that might be their lane. But I always try to make the kind of connections of like, we are all working towards sovereignty and liberation, right? Like liberation in our lifetime is the goal, right? So it doesn't have to be, we don't have to decolonize. And I also think too, there's a lot of folks that like, even my elders, they were like, I wouldn't consider this decolonizing, right? But it is, it's fundamentally what they're doing, but they might not just consider it that, right? So it's just, I think an invitation is usually what I try to do and say like, this is just one way of doing things and one way of seeing things, but you're more than welcome to invite and explore other options that might land better for you.
Awesome. And then I see Love, and I think you will be our last question of the day. So absolutely no pressure. I'm going to turn it over to you to talk to Dr. BlackDeer.
Tabatne, Dr. BlackDeer, I have a question about truth commissions in an academic setting with urban Indian tribes. So there's one coming up. I wanted to know your opinion or your thoughts about having that for urban Indian tribes held at an institution. And what are your thoughts about truth commissions and the uprising of them in Indigenous and tribal spaces, Native American specifically?
Yeah, so I think it depends. I mean, everything is it depends. That's a go-to academic answer, right? It depends. But one of the big things that I think about and what I've kind of been wrestling with a lot is that the idea of like reconciliation or healing, right, is that both parties have to be ready for that. And so I think a lot of times folks are like land acknowledgements, truth commissions, it'll be nice words, but will that actually do the healing work, right? Like, are the institutions that folks were held at, are they ready to really be in community and enter into a reciprocal relationship with folks where they can be held accountable, where they can truly work to make amends and repairs? So truth commissions are essentially where folks really try to reckon with the colonialism that, or the colonial legacy of whatever they used to do. So some Love, if you want to do this, you're more than welcome to. Some folks I think do them, like we've seen them in like religious organizations, right? That they're like, oh, these boarding schools used to hold Indigenous youth that were removed. Thank you, Dr. Ruth, for putting that in the chat. There's a lot of, I think to me, it's essentially like trying to reckon with that colonial history. And so the idea is that you center Indigenous voices throughout that process. And it's really in this more Indigenous experience or tradition of like restorative justice. But oftentimes I think people don't understand what restorative justice is, or they think that we'll just have a couple meetings and move on with our lives. And so I do question the kind of like in-depth nature, because we know organizations are usually not well lent to kind of longitudinal interactions, right? They just kind of want to do the thing, check the box, and move on. So I always wonder, like, are folks truly ready to kind of show up and enter into this relationship in a reciprocal way? Or will they just kind of further harm folks in that process?
Dr. BlackDeer, thank you so much again for answering all of the questions. Thank each and every one of you, and even those that have already signed off, for being a part of today's Inclusion Talk series. Dr. BlackDeer, one more time, will you let people know where they can find you if they want to connect with you?
Yes, absolutely. You can find me on Instagram and Twitter and LinkedIn at Dr. BlackDeer, and you can send me an email at a2blackdeer@gmail.com.
Fantastic. Thank each and every one of you all for attending today's Inclusion Talk series. Thank you for supporting Compass Family Services. This is our last Inclusion Talk series of the year. Remember, you can follow Compass Family Services on all social platforms. If you want to see this recording and past Inclusion Talk series recordings, go to Compass Family Services on YouTube. Please take a moment to fill out the post-event survey. We are going to collect that data, share it with Dr. BlackDeer. It's truly important as we continue offering these to the community, and I hope everybody has a fantastic day. Thank you, everyone.